Right. Good evening. I hope you can all hear me. Tony and I had a slight problem earlier on, but I think it's okay now. So I did a talk, it was last year, towards the end of last year, pre-lockdown, on the wartime pipeline and storage system. So I'm not going over that except very briefly. I'm going to be going through the post-war system, particularly looking at its impact on the Cold War, but also its impact on the civil system, particularly civil aviation. I'm going to remove my picture and so that you can see mainly the screen. Right, so as I said, before and during World War II, a largely unknown, but there was a massive system of protected storage depots and pipelines constructed, and it is still probably the largest remnant of what was actually built during the war to fight the war that is still, at least in part, in operation. And in my last talk, I looked at site construction, pipeline construction, and tank construction. And this is the system that was in 1944. As you can see, it sort of ran from the Mersey, Humber, Avonmouth, and Thames, with lines up into East Anglia, and there were lines down to the invasion ports and, of course, the somewhat infamous PLUTO pipelines. And then we had the end of the war, victory in Europe, surrender of Japan, and the system was closed down. This is a picture. I have pictures of, I think, 3 storage depots taken at the end of the war. They got everybody to line up. It was in June. Obviously, the war in Europe had ended. There was still the war in Japan carrying on a bit longer, but obviously that had a much less impact. And so there was a desire to shut down and mothball the system to save money. And really, the great majority of the system was demanned and placed on a care and maintenance base. And I must say the care and maintenance was pretty limited. There was a vast amount of fuel was sold off and included a considerable amount of high-octane fuel, which was one of the things that gave us a big advantage over the Germans during World War II. There was a small amount of pipeline. You can picture the map. There was a pipeline from Avonmouth, ran up to Stourport, was utilised to supply a commercial storage depot. Regent Oil, which has now become Texaco, at Stourport. And then the rest of the system was filled with water, and we went back to pre-war delivering by road, rail and barge and coastal tankers. So when did that change? First thing, the cold winter of 1947. Now, I was born in 1951, so obviously I don't remember it. I do remember the cold winter of 1963, but this one was even worse. And there was really a pretty well total breakdown in our delivery system. And at this time, 92% of UK fuel supplies came either directly or indirectly from coal. Obviously, people burnt coals in their houses. First house I can remember, 1955, when I was 4, we had a coal fire. A large amount was turned into electricity, and coal was also turned into town gas. And then the Cold War. Relationships between the United States, the UK, and Russia rapidly deteriorated, and In 1946, Winston Churchill made his Iron Curtain speech in, I think it was Fulton, Missouri. It wasn't actually necessarily well received at the time. And by April 46, the RAF had drawn up detailed plans for a nuclear attack on 67 Soviet cities. This included attacks on southern Russia, flying from bases on the Suez Canal. There is apparently a map still held by the RAF showing these. The Truman Doctrine was American doctrine that they would go to the support of anybody threatened by communism. And in March 47 was a pact between UK and France. And then the next important step was in February 48, Czechoslovakia, the communists seized power, which led to the European countries, or at least the UK, France and Benelux signing the Brussels Pact. And a year later, NATO was formed with the above plus the countries listed there. I won't go through them all. So NATO's now been going for quite a time. I think the next important stage on the system was the Berlin blockade, which lasted for nearly a year. As far as I can see, the system was still not in operation, but obviously there were a large number of planes flying from the UK to Berlin and from other places as well. Now, I must admit, I never realized until I did the research for my book that the Americans had actually left the UK, but the United States Army Air Force, as it was styled, left in February 46, and in July 48, 2 USA B-29 bomber groups moved here. B-29s weren't used in Europe during the Second World War. They were used exclusively in Japan. It was put about in the press that they were equipped to carry nuclear weapons, but in fact they weren't at the time. That was done later. And then the key date, June 1950, North Korea invades the South, or of course, if there's any North Koreans here, North Korea responded to an unprovoked attack on them in June 1950. I just thought I'd put that in to be neutral. So how did the government respond to the Cold Winter and the Cold War concerning recommissioning and actually expanding the government pipeline system? First thing was a study by into storing fuel in salt cavities, which became a major, and ICI developed a test cavity for storing fuel. It's only 5,000 cubes. That's about the same size as a main storage tank. 5,000 cubes is 5 million litres. My car takes about 50 litres, so enough to fill 100,000 cars. And it was in 1950 the system was recommissioned. I'm sure it took a while. One operator at the main storage site at Aldermaston comments that the site was buried beneath rubbish and long grass. That was when he joined Shellmex and BP. And as I said, I don't think it was particularly maintained. It was more abandoned. And in the early 1950s, 3 American bomber groups, each of 90 B-29s, based at RAF Sculthorpe, which is in the northern Norfolk, at Marham and Lakenheath in Suffolk. And as well as reconstruction, spare pipelines were built from the storage depot in Thetford to supply them. One of the mysteries I had when I joined the Oil and Pipelines Agency in 1990 was why certain air bases had very modern receipt facilities and others had very ancient ones. And I actually, through again researching my book, found this was all linked to Strategic Air Command. Basically, where Strategic Air Command bombers were placed, they had pipelines built at the time, whereas the other pipelines were generally built later and to a more modern design. And the old connections were never upgraded. And this is a diagram of a salt cavity. Now, you may not be aware, but there is a vast expanse of rock salt in Cheshire. And I worked for British Gas for 10 years, and British Gas used rock salt, but off the coast to store high pressure gas. But this well predated that, and this was the idea. And it says, if you can read the detail, 40,000 tons of oil, which is 50,000 cubes. So 50 million litres. To put that into context, each one of the salt cavity storage could hold the equivalent to 10 large World War II tanks. And at the site Plumley, they built 34 of these salt cavities. So that's equivalent to 340 tanks. Now, the largest storage depot was Aldermaston, which had 46 tanks. So that gives you the idea of strategic storage. And so basically it was constructed in the rock salt using saline to create the cavity. You would then pump oil in, and then to pump the oil back out, you would use saline solution to displace it. And some of the storage was used for storing crude oil, and some of it was used for storing refined oil. So 1951, obviously very much influenced by what was going on in Korea at the time. The government decided to build 34 of these storage, 1.5 million cubic meters, 1.5 billion liters. And the filling of the salt cavities started in 1955. And these are the pumps at Plumley in Cheshire. And that is the top of the salt cavity. If you ever look at the Ordnance Survey map, a detailed one, it's quite interesting how they've drawn this out. It sort of stands out very different from the other sites, and quite distinctive. And this is the Stanlow Complex. I don't know if you can read this. It must be set on my screen. I can read at the top, but the details of the map, which are contained in my book, are fairly difficult to read. But it was all basically linked to the Stanlow refinery. So you had the Plumley salt cavities. You also had some salt cavities at Cape of Good Hope farm, which was not in South Africa, which was a Navy base where they had two absolutely massive salt cavities. I think they became inoperable quite early on. They were certainly inoperable at the time that I joined OPA. And then linked to that was a site called Goosetree, which provided the road and rail facilities to pump out, as well as through the main pipeline. And there were some other going up the River Mersey. There were some new storage depots built at Carlet Plant and Long Plantation. And this was in addition to World War II facilities built at Backford South, Backford North and Worthing. So it was quite a complex, and it was operated by Shell. So expanding the system, as well as the decision to build this salt cavity, it was decided to build a new Transpennine pipeline. There was an existing Transpennine which ran from Backford to Misterton, but there was a new one which would run all the way across to the Humber, with 3 new storage depots at Rawcliffe, Bramwell and Blackmore. I will come a bit into the reason to the pipeline, but the problem was the existing pipeline suffered very badly from corrosion. And at the same time, the Americans decided to build pipelines to RAF Elvington and Stansted Montfitchet, what we now know as Stansted Airport. They were going to be used as strategic Air Force bases. In fact, they were never used, and the pipelines at that time were never commissioned. In fact, the one to Elvington was never, ever commissioned. And they decided that their original bases, which were on the eastern, basically East Anglia, were too vulnerable to attack. And and they decided to move further west to Bryce Norton, Upper Hayford, Fairford, and of course the somewhat later infamous Greenman Common. And all of these again had spare pipelines built to them and receipt facilities. So this is the pipeline system 1964. The coloration is based on whether the pipeline network was run by what was then the Ministry of Power or the Ministry of Defence. The Ministry of Defence was formed in 64 when the previous separate air ministries, Admiralty and War Office, were amalgamated. And so the pipelines in blue came under the Ministry of Defence, whereas the ones in sort of browny, khaki came under the Ministry of Power, which later became Department of Energy, later BNOC, and still later, still the Oil and Pipelines Agency. And you'll notice there's still the two pipelines up in the north. I am presuming the old pipeline. I'll get the pen again. So this is the World War II pipeline, and this is the post-war pipeline. I presume the World War II was still run to a limited extent because there was later shown controls on it, but that it was run at a lower pressure because of corrosion problems. So these are some of the sites. These are new ones, Blackmore. These are along the Transpennine. In addition to that, to try and get fuel in the country, remember, obviously, we haven't got any North Sea oil, so we had to get everything imported. There were 3 new important import facilities constructed: Redcliffe Bay in North Somerset, Killingholme on the Humber, and Faslane in Scotland. Now, the North Somerset was a quite innovative. I'll show you a picture later, but it was basically, the idea was, and it was planned pre-hydrogen bomb. It was on the basis that an atomic bomb would not Bristol out, which is the Avonmouth, and there were submarine pipelines such that tankers could come and offload into Redcliffe Bay, and then from they were connected to the main pipeline system to also depots at Portishead and Flaxburton, from which there were road and rail facilities. And there were 2 16-inch pipelines connecting. These were much bigger than any pipeline built on the GPSS. The typical size in the wartime was 10 or 12-inch, and with lines going off to air bases from more 6-inch. And the Killingholme and North Somerset with 15 tanks. Some of those were 8,000 ton instead of the normal 4,000 ton. They also had some 8,000 tons at Redcliffe Bayers and also Flaxburton. And there was a jetty, road and rail facilities, and it was later connected to the pipeline system. And I said also this large import system at Faslane on the Clyde, which received direct from tankers. So this is the Redcliffe Bay, and those are the 3 submarine lines. My understanding is that it was commissioned and never used again. And in fact, due to the Severn estuary, the submarine lines sort of rapidly silted up. So as a scheme, it was not necessarily that successful, but Redcliffe Bay was still to have a long history and is still going. So this is Redcliffe Bay before it was built. And these are some of the pipelines running across to Flaxburton, which is south of Bristol near Nailsea. I think actually Flax is quite near Bristol Airport. And these are, I showed you some of these pictures in my previous talk. But those are tanks, the tank bottom, just to give you an idea for anybody who hasn't seen tank construction. And the tanks being mounded over. Rail sidings under construction. And road gantry. That looks to me a bit like a I'm just trying to think. I'm sure someone will be able to identify that as more of a car person than me. And this is the Killingholme jetty under construction off the North Sea. And these are the Killingholme tank tunnels. These are totally different to any other tank tunnels in any other GPSS site. I must consider they should be the 8th wonder of the world. They just stretch on forever. They're all underground. Normally, tanks have their individual or they're in groups, but this is was all underneath, and quite, mind you, made engineering them quite a major task and very expensive. And accidents did happen. This is at Redcliffe Bay. The side wall is collapsing, and there it's completely gone. I believe nobody was hurt, fortunately, in that. Again, if you go back, you will rather notice the lack of protective equipment, no hard hats. Goodness knows what he's working off. Health and safety would have had an apoplectic fit. I would imagine the HSC would have had there would have been a legal action following that if that had happened a few years later. And this is a somewhat accident bump at Killingholme. Killingholme was built on the cheap. I think it was £164,000. And basically it's out in the North Sea. You get tankers, and to protect it from tankers, it was equipped with, I think, what you could describe as bumpers. And unfortunately, like a bumper trying to keep off an articulated lorry, bumpers weren't very good at keeping off tankers when you had a North Sea storm. And I read in a paper that having spent 164,000 building it, they then over the next few years spent another 160,000 repairing accidents before someone had a bright idea. Why don't we actually rethink this and actually get some system in that will protect it from these tankers such that we're not repairing it the whole time? So moving on to the Suez crisis, which led to the blocking of the Suez Canal and petrol queues. It must be said, I was only 5 at the time. My parents didn't have a car, so I don't have a strong memory of this, but there might be a few here who do. So basically the Suez crisis showed that we were really no longer a world power. Actually, it's an interesting point. At the start of the Korean War, the British armed forces were actually larger than the American armed forces. But, and we still is, so we had 700,000 armed forces at the time of Suez. There was a cutback to 375. Apparently the then Minister of Defence, Duncan Sands, and General Templar, who's famous for having won a guerrilla war in Malaysia, showing you can win them, had a stand-up fight over the cuts. And the RAF was drastically reduced and most aircraft projects were cancelled. I think about the only ones that wasn't was the Lightning went ahead and the TSR-2 continued, though of course that was later cancelled as well. And a large number of storage depots that had been part of the RAF and the War Office were transferred to the Ministry of Power for Civil Storage, because one of the things of this was we wanted to store as much fuel as we can. But it must be said, some of these depots, they only stored 2,000 tonnes, 2,500 cubes. Now, if you think back to our Plumley Salt Cavities, each one 50,000 cubes, they didn't really add a huge amount. So in 1964, they managed about 50 storage depots, but there were still RAF and our Royal Navy storage depots increase. But it was also decided that the salt cavities needed to be increased, that they would double the size. So it meant that each one in turn, they had to be emptied out and then increased. This did have a long-term negative impact because when I was at OPA, we looked into the possibility of actually using, when they weren't required for storing fuel, to store gas in them. But because they'd increased the size, they were too close to the surface such that the pressure at which the gas could be stored was it was not economic to do it. And this is an example of a small storage depot, Dunraggett in Scotland. It's also a fairly strange one. As you'll notice, it's not semi-buried, it's covered in brick. It was on the west coast of Scotland. It was not considered during the war to be a high risk. And so it was just clad in brick. And this sort of site was used mainly for storing paraffin for local people in the area. And this is a diagram of the entire very complicated system. You can see that there are storage depots all over the country. It does also include some commercial pipelines which have been built since then, which I'll mention briefly. It's just to give you a general idea of how the situation had progressed. So as well as dealing with the Cold War, there was also the growth of civil aviation and car ownership. 1946, Heathrow Airport became London's airport. Before that, one time it was Croydon, and then I think it was Helston, which was where, if I remember, Chamberlain made his famous speech on not peace in our time, but that effect. And so it was actually supplied from the Walton Storage Depot. Aviation fuel came across from Avonmouth. 1953, Heathrow 62,000 flights with over 1 million passengers. I don't know how that compares at the moment. I do sometimes look to see how many flights are taken off and on from Heathrow and Gatwick, which isn't too many at the moment. So 1955, Hurst Terminal opened, and the BP Isle of Grain refinery supplies Walton via TG, stands for Thames Grain, because this was originally a pipeline supplying PLUTO via Dungeness with a link up to storage on the Isle of Grain. And Esso Fawley also supplied coming up from the south coast. So those were two supplying Heathrow. And in 1958, Gatwick opened, and part of the feeding was by road tanker from a rail-fed depot, Rowfant, which was on the East Grinstead to Crawley line. The line shut down later. You can walk it. It's called the Worth Way. I've walked it between East Grinstead and Three Bridges. And the depot was actually demolished in 1991, but you can still see some of the buildings there. And in 1951, the first commercial owned pipeline was built from Walton to Heathrow, which is a very short distance. And in 1963, Esso built their own pipeline to Heathrow, so they no longer used our system. And then the Beeching Acts. The number of railway lines had actually been being reduced over a long period. Said 19,500 miles. By 62, that was reduced to 17,500. And Beeching reduced the network to just over 12,000 miles. I know when I was walking the Thames, I was surprised to find some spur pipelines that had survived, but I worked out the reason why they had survived was mostly because they were had Conservative MPs standing for them. They were in rich, affluent areas where the commuters demanded they carried on. But quite a lot of the pipeline depots lost their rail lines, and if they're not connected by pipeline, they're not connected by rail. The only way you can fill them up is through road tanker and empty them, which becomes extremely uneconomic. It takes a hell of a lot of road tankers to fill a 5,000 cube tank. So I haven't gone through all the figures, but you can see how rapidly the car ownership went up with, on a personal note, I moved, as said, into Whittle, which is in Surrey in 1955 on a council estate. In our road of about 90 houses, there were only 3 in 55 that had cars. But that had greatly increased by 1965, the number of cars overall was 3 times as many. And so this inspired Conoco to leased one of the depots to be supplied from the Immingham refinery. And then they leased a number of other sites, going quite round as far as Aldermaston for road loading of ground fuels. And those were still in operation at the time I joined OPRA in 1990. And this is actually, this was a railway enthusiast picture of steam trains at Rowfant, rail tankers. And this is actually one of the storage depots, Purton sidings in 1970. They were later removed. And that's the road loading. I've got no idea what's being stored here. And that's a site, Shuckstoke. I think that's the only picture I've got of the Shuckstoke depot. I really got no idea how we came to have it, but it was a useful one to include. Again, I don't think health and safety would be terribly happy with this chap sitting there, no helmet on top of the tank. Shuckstoke again has since closed. Now, improvement 1950s. The World War II pipelines were built, they weren't welded together. They were built using a thing called a Victolic coupling, which was basically like a collar over, to put two pieces of pipe and put a collar to join it. Unfortunately, when they built the system, they were designing it for the war, and when they brought in, they leaked. One of the people I worked with, who was pipeline control center manager, joined in when he was 18. He's about the same age as me, so he doesn't remember this time. But when he first joined, there were old people working on sites, and apparently they used to make a lot of money on overtime going out and fixing leaks. One of the problems, the pipelines weren't protected. People really didn't know a lot about the way they would corrode. One of the things that came in was called Cathodic Protection. As I said, the pipes are built of steel, cast steel, so they will obviously rust. Cathodic Protection is a system of putting pieces of metal, basically, which will rust in turn and protect sending electric current, so that that piece of metal rusts rather than the pipe. And the record, it must be said, of leaks, as I said, was not good. I got a paper from 1961 which talks about the level of leaks that were then happening. And so to get around this on the Victolic couplings, in the 1950s, it was decided to relay the entire network. And by 70, it was reached 50 miles, 80 kilometers per year. Certainly, I did a job on putting in geographic information system, and we mapped not just the pipelines, but the old abandoned pipelines. And you could see that across the whole system, there was abandoned pipelines alongside the original pipes. And in the 1980s, the Intelligent Pig, which was a British gas corporation. The Americans developed gas pipelines before we did, but they worked on the principle that it was too difficult to try and monitor them and correct them, and they would just pay up for the explosions and the deaths and casualties caused. British Gas decided they couldn't do that in this overcrowded country, and so they developed a device that you basically put down a pipeline and it would monitor the corrosion. And with the pipes being welded at a set length, it would register each weld, so you could work out where the corrosion was. And you'd send an Intelligent Pig down the pipeline, and it would come back with a report telling you the levels of corrosion, from you need to close this pipeline immediately and repair it, to this needs to be done pretty soon, and to keep an eye on it, to no problem. I did actually manage to persuade a temporary secretary that Intelligent Pigs were specially trained pigs that we sent down the pipelines, and they squeaked when they found corrosion. It must be said, given some of the pipelines that are only 10-inch, they'd have to have been pretty small pigs. So this is a pipeline relay in the 1970s. As you can see, they did over quite a wide area at each go. This is from a World War II, a cleaning pig, which there was a Pathy film which described it as Housewife's dream of a perfect flue cleaner. There are a whole range of different pigs. This is sphere pigs. The pipelines carried multiple fuels, and at one time it was thought you needed to put the spheres in to separate one fuel from the other. Later it was discovered as long as you handled it properly, the fuel didn't really mix and they weren't used again. And this is an intelligent pig. It must be said this is a very unhappy intelligent pig. It was damaged. Soon after I joined OPA, I think in about 1991, the tail end of a pig got stuck, left behind in where the pipeline crossed over the River Wey in National Trust land, which it must be said, we as the managing agents weren't very happy. The operators BPA weren't very happy. The manufacturer of the pig wasn't very happy because they cost a hell of a lot of money, and neither were the National Trust. And it took a lot of work to cut and get it out without getting any fuel into the River Wey. And this is, by comparison with that previous one, these are modern cleaning pigs. You still have to run cleaning pigs quite regularly to keep the pipelines clean. Now, instrument SCADA. Sorry, I'm a control engineer, and this is where I started from 1973. SCADA stands for Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition. It is the idea that you have computers to monitor pipelines. Obviously, during World War II, you didn't. When it was originally built, you only had pressure meters, ammeters, and the like. And it continued in the 1950s, limited instrumentation, some attempts to monitor flow rates. 1959, the first control centre, it doesn't say there, but it was built at Aldermaston, but it was just to monitor pressure, temperatures and flows. And there were a series of control centres at various different bases. So this is from World War II, someone looking at a pressure gauge. That is the 1950s control panel. Again, 1950s. And this is a diagram showing the, not controls, but the monitoring systems. And so there is, it's completely fragmented. There's a system here, Saffron Walden, East Anglia. That's the Aldermaston. There's one at Nettlestead Green in Kent. There's one at Stourport. And there's one at Misterton. And you can also see that a lot of the system isn't covered at all. That whole area isn't covered there. So it's pretty fragmented. And moving on, the Cold War gets colder or hotter, depending on which way you want to view it. Soviet SS-20s, which got the West very worried, mobile nuclear missiles able to hit the West. And we replied with cruise missiles in Greenham Common, other places as well. But and of course we had the famous Greenham Common camps. I've forgotten the name of the actress, but who died very recently in her 50s, rather sadly. But in one of the films she appeared, she'd been a Greenham Common protester before she became a lawyer, left-wing lawyer. In response to Cold War getting colder, there was a whole series of new pipelines. USEF Squadrons, RAF Woodbridge and Bentwaters, which is quite near Ipswich, were not on the pipeline. The nearest storage depot was a small depot at Claydon. I actually, in the 1980s, worked at, they had A-10 tank busters based at those sites, and I worked at British Gas, and they used to target our, didn't obviously fire anything, but for strafing funds, they used to line up our compressors, which was a bit alarming when they came streaking in. Anyway, in 1974, pipelines were built from Saffron Walden and Thetford to Claydon, which is probably about, I should imagine, in length, the biggest post-war, or at least certainly after the 1950s, pipeline network built. And Woodbridge and Bentwaters were connected by pipelines. And also the line from Thameshaven to Saffron Walden was upgraded to class 600. This means that it could operate at 99 bar, which is something like £1,400 per square inch, getting on for double what its previous operating pressure. And a series of new pump stations that were diesel pumps and could operate if power was cut. So these are the new tanks being built. There was a whole range of sites built them. And that is a pump house from the 1970s. There was a whole other group of defence pipelines because, quite amazingly, most RAF bases were not fed by pipelines. Early 1980s, a pipeline was built to supply Waddington, Coningsby, and also Scampton, coal to shore. There were a localised pipeline built from the depot in Inverness to supply RAF Kinloss and Lossiemouth. Kinloss has stopped, but Lossiemouth is still operational and still pipeline fed. In Cornwall, there was one from Falmouth to St Morgan. And I mean, the amazing Cottermouth Moor and Wittering were hardly any distance from the one of the main pipelines built during the war, but it still wasn't built to it. Wattisham was an advantage built off the line going to Claydon. And again, new pump houses were put in. So this is actually a river crossing on the Inverness Kinloss Lossiemouth pipeline. And that's the system. It doesn't show the lines either in Cornwall or Scotland, but that's the system as it was in 1986. So again, this is the line going to Claydon, Bentwaters, and then connecting. That was the original World War II pipeline. So that went in, and as I said, this was upgraded to from Thameshaven was upgraded to class 600. And this is the line going down here, which was built as well. So quite an extensive in the 80s. Now, so I'm a control engineer, so I have a great interest in this. So 1970s, fitting of Foxborough Spec 200. I started my career at a company, Foxborough Yoxall. I realise most people won't have heard it. It had a factory in Redhill, Surrey, 1,650 people, still closed. It was a worldwide company. Now, in the early 1970s, that was state-of-the-art instrumentation, and it was like trying to get your son into Eton, getting hold of it. But it was quite a pleasant surprise when I joined OPA in 1990 and found this stuff was there and it was still working. And I concluded that the salesman saying this was the most wonderful thing you'd ever come across were not entirely lying. The control centres were enhanced. Saffron Walden covered all of East Anglia. And you actually had the first true SCADA at Rawcliffe, where it could actually control things. It could move valves and it could start and stop pumps. And it was controlled into 3 control centres at Rawcliffe in the north, Saffron Walden, East Anglia and Aldermaston. And 1980, the first SCADA was installed at Aldermaston to control some of the pipelines. I remember reading an article from the time. The main operator, BPA, used to have an in-house magazine. And it seems strange to read it 20 years later. And this person thought, this seemed like almost out of the world. The fact that you could press a button and start a valve, open a valve or start a pump. It must be said you had to wait a little while. I was told by someone at the Rawcliffe system that they started to open a valve. They went across, made a cup of tea, came back, drank it, and by the time they'd done that, the valve had finally opened. In 1980s, there was actually levels. The tanks used to be filled to the brim, and it relied on operators doing it. It was finally decided that with overfills, this was not acceptable, and high-level switches were put in. I've got shutdowns. I don't think they were shutdowns. They were just level switches. And actually, I found some letters from both the RAF and the United States Air Force complaining about these because it meant they couldn't pack. They wanted to pack as much fuel into every depot as they could. And the fact that you could no longer fill them right to the brim, they were not happy about. And to actually give a level, there was float gauges that measured the level were fitted. It must be said they weren't always entirely too accurate. And Saffron Walden Control Centre was closed, so we just had 2, which was about the time. So this is Spec 200. And that is the Pipeline Control Centre when I joined. Complete mass of everything. There was about 3 systems there. And I don't know if Chris Townsend is tuned in. He said he was going to be, but this is a picture of him. And I know I had a 1940s picture, and it said you could tell it was 1940s from the hairstyle of the ladies. Similarly, from the mullet style, you can tell this is 1980s. He's actually got 2 of his sons are now working on the system, and it was rumoured the operating company made them sign a contract not to have a barbecue together in case they all got food poisoning, and there was a crisis at the control centre. Well, that's true. I don't know. Now, the problem with, I'm sure you can remember the 70s, there were cuts going on trying to keep money down. And these small storage depots, they didn't store much fuel. And so there was a program of closing them down. There was also a problem in the salt cavities, particularly in the crude oil sludge built up. One of the wonderful things, the Treasury decided to increase the charges for oil companies using them, and so they just pulled out. And then in the 1980s, with the advent of North Sea oil, Margaret Thatcher decided there was no need for civil storage, so it ended. However, a lot of storage depots were saved from closure due to the fact that as the Cold War got rather nasty in these days, and so a lot of these civil storage were instead switched to military storage. But still, despite that, between 70 and 89, 35 depots were closed. And this is some demolition. This is actually one of the Claydon sites. It was demolished in the 2000s. But that was quite small. That's the typical of the small tanks that were used in the distribution depots. Somewhat bigger tanks. This is, I think, Rowfant in Sussex. And that is a depot near Fawley Refinery, and that's what it looks like when it was put back to civil storage. There are still some depots around that haven't been demolished, and the problem is they're in rural areas, and it would cost far more to demolish them than you'll get back for turning them into farmland. I think this particular site cost £200,000 to demolish and was sold for £20,000, which is somewhat uneconomic. But there were new commercial developments. When I was at OPA, Gatwick Pipeline was a bit of a sore point. It was actually pre-OPA. It was the British National Oil Corporation, for any who can remember it. They came up with the idea of building a pipeline to Gatwick Airport from basically off one of the existing pipelines. At the time, it was the idea came up in the late 1970s. The Minister for Energy was Tony Benn, who was, of course, entirely enthusiastic. However, Labour lost the 1979 election. Thatcher came in. She did not want a commercial pipeline. So the operators basically took the plan that BNOC had developed for building the pipeline, took it to commercial people, and they built it. It would have been an absolute money winner for the government system if they had built it, but there they didn't. There were some other commercial depots. I won't go through into the detail. The Windham was quite an important ground fuels in East Anglia, covering throughout that area, and lasted quite a while. Come to the two key airports, Stansted and the Manchester Jet Line, which was later in the 1990s. Basically, I mentioned that in the 1950s, the Americans, bless their cotton socks, built a pipeline down to Stansted with the idea of using it for nuclear bombers. The system was never commissioned. Around 1990, OPA had now been set up to manage the pipeline system. We weren't allowed to invest public money in it, but we could try and persuade other people to invest it. And our commercial manager managed to persuade BAA that it would be an extremely good idea to have a pipeline that was not owned by any of the oil companies and that everybody could use. And there was this pipeline. All they had to do was pay for the recommissioning, which they did. That was going on about the time I joined. I think one of my first projects was to have a look at how it was going on the instrumentation side. And this is the pipe works with the new pumps to supply in Stansted. And of course, that still is, I think, unless there's any change, still the only pipeline in Stansted. Similarly, I haven't got any pictures of the Manchester Jet Line, but a commercial outfit came up with the fact that they could use one of our pipelines that was no longer used, extend it, and so supply Manchester. So that was also supplied by fuel. And of course, Manchester, I think, is the only airport apart from Heathrow which has got two runways. So that was supplied from Backford. But there were still additional military devices going on in the 1980s. RAF Lucas is quite near St Andrews, and NATO had a policy that all NATO air bases needed to have half their fuel stored off-site. And so a storage depot was built in 1988 at Linkswood, about 5 miles away, and a pipeline was run through to it. The actual pipeline was supplied by rail. And then the Americans wanted Fairford, which they were still using, and so supplied. A pipeline was built from Calm up to RAF Fairford in the 1990s. And Inverness didn't have enough storage. It must be said that Ministry of Defence faffed around for years, finally decided they did want storage, and then gave it to OPA, and having spent about 5 years trying to make up their mind, demanded that we built it in a year, which we actually managed to do. There was also going to be a pipeline to Leaming. Leaming is in Yorkshire. I think it's supposed to be the main air defence, which is on the basis we're not sure who we're going to be attacked from, so we better have one in the middle. And it is really the only major base which is not pipeline fed. They were going to use this pipeline that the Americans again built in the 1950s but never commissioned, to Elvington and extend it to Leaming. Unfortunately, MOD faffed around for so long that the Cold War ended and NATO said they weren't paying for it, and so it came to an end. And this is actual rail loading facilities going on at Linkswood. This was our last remaining rail facility still in operation. This is the Calne-Fairford line, and that is one of the new tanks at Inverness. As you will notice, it's above ground. To build an above ground tank cost about 1 million. To build a semi-buried protected tank cost about 5 million. Later on, the men from the ministry did complain about why they're above ground tanks, because someone could come along with a bazooka and hit it. And the answer was, well, that's what you decided to do to save money. And so we come to the end of the Cold War. Man of the Year, Gorbachev, though he failed to actually achieve what he was trying to achieve. The come down of the Berlin Wall and the first Gulf War. I joined in September 1990 at the time of Desert Shield, it was called, before Desert Storm. And it must be said that GPSS was pretty frenetic. There was one hell of a lot of American planes flying in and out, and the fuel was a lot of static storage depots that hadn't seen anything happen for years were emptied and refilled and emptied again. It was all incredibly active. But after the Gulf War, end of Cold War, there was really quite a major shutdown. I'm not going to go through all these in detail, but you did see a large number, and also a large number of static storage depots. It was rather depressing from my point of view, because we were a lot of these static depots had no instrumentation, they weren't on computers, they had nothing, and we were going to put it all in, lots of nice work to keep us busy for quite a while, and then they all got shut down. So in 1989, there were 40 operation storage depots, 32 on the ring main, 4 pipeline connected, and 4 were just supplied by other means. And by 1999, it had dropped to 21. I think there's now about 13. So in a decade, about half the sites had closed. There was also some commercial closures during the period, particularly road loading. Most road loading ended on the GPSS for various reasons. And so the only multi-product is across the Transpennine to Bramall. And a pipeline down. There was a gas-fired power station called Little Balford. But with these gas-fired power stations, if there's a shortage of gas for whatever reason, they can cut them off and they need to use gas oil. So they had some gas oil tanks, and this was to store them up pump them up if necessary. This was actually the project I got brought in mainly to do, to work on the computer control system, get it improved communication, leak detection. I mentioned that it could take several minutes to get a valve to move. Well, this system got it going in 2 seconds. So quite an improvement. You could actually send a command and you could see it got it and was doing something about it. High accuracy automatic tank gauges were fitted across the storage depots. And again, the Rawcliffe system. I had a bit of a reputation for being dubious on the leak detection systems, because they often didn't work. SO, who had money to throw at equipment, bought a leak detection system and they just could not get it to work. The people we found that actually came up with the leak detection were in Slovakia. The reason was that in Eastern Europe, people would go along and drill into pipelines and take fuel out. So you needed to go and identify them very rapidly. And they actually managed to develop a leak detection system that worked incredibly well. It must be said, all these Slovaks, their English was a hell of a lot better than our Czechoslovak. They were very communicative and very good. And one of my latter projects, this was as I was retiring, we had to upgrade the Ordermaster, and the whole system was set so that one control center could take over from the other in an emergency, which becomes irrelevant into an incident which happened later. So that's what the control center looked like in the 1980s, and that was in the 1990s. Rather sadly, the guy there, a very nice chap, died very suddenly. And that's a sort of SCADA computer mimic. This is the Rawcliffe after it was upgraded. And that is the adaptive mimic that you can click on, a later control that everything you went to, you clicked on one and it took you to that site. And there was still increase. There was, as I'm sure you noticed before the lockdowns and everything, there was greatly increased in air traffic and needed more facilities to bring aviation fuel in quicker. The GG pipeline never actually went ahead. This was going to go down from our Thames Grain to directly to Gatwick Airport. But again, I said OPA could not pay for it, and AirPB decided against it. But there were new pump sets. There was a new import facility at Royal Portbury Dock, and Redcliffe Bay, which was the one which had the submarine cables which never worked, was recommissioned and brought back in. And so this is some of the new pumps going in. And that's what was a whole Western import system. The idea was to speed. Tankers are incredibly expensive. They charge at an incredible rate. So the idea was that a tanker would come in, it would unload in two directions, that way and to Redcliffe Bay at the same time. These were 16-inch pipes, so they could unload very rapidly. Sorry, I've drawn the wrong line. It goes there to Hallen. And then after the tanker's gone away, Hallen would feed the rest of the system and Redcliffe Bay could top it up. And that is the Portbury import facilities for tankers. This is Redcliffe Bay, brought back into operation in the 2000s. And then happened Buncefield. I mentioned control of major accident hazards. This was legislation. It was actually prompted by a major explosion that happened in Italy. European legislation, when of course we were part of the EU, and it spread to other, and our government brought in the control of major accident hazards. And basically any site that stored large amounts of explosive, flammable, dangerous or other, depending on the amounts, had to have safety reports and other documentation in hand. Now, Buncefield was not a GPSS site. It was a large commercial multi-owner storage depot connected to a number of different pipelines. What's called the United Kingdom oil pipeline, which is the biggest commercial pipeline. The Fena line, which was built in about 1990 and is the last major commercial lines built, and then also supplied Heathrow and Gatwick. On the 11th of December 2005, it was receiving fuel from UCOP. At 5:20, tanks started to overfill. At 6:01, there was the first of a series of multiple explosions. I remember hearing it on the news, and I always say there were two types of engineers in the petroleum industry: those who said, "Thank God it's got nothing to do with me," and those who said, "Oh God." No one was killed, but 40 were injured. Widespread devastation, £900 million. And also 40% of supplies to Heathrow Gatwick were lost. The Fena line was closed for 18 months. I remember I was actually in the office after Christmas, which was normally a quiet time, but we were there. It was our line and the SO line were keeping Heathrow and Gatwick going, and it was a total panic. So instead of getting on with writing contracts, which I thought I'd be doing, I was busy on that. And there was a major investigation which actually ended up blaming the management, not the operators. It must be said that our operators' first reaction was, what were the operators doing while this overfilling was going on? So that's the original Buncefield depot before explosion. Tanks on fire. I think there was about 11 tanks. That's a view from the motorway. And that's what it looked like at the end. It's certainly by far the most massive tank fire we've had in this country, since World War II. And basically the system was followed by, I realise I'm going on, so a whole series of depots, more military cuts and closures. I won't go through those. This is Falmouth. There was a whole complex of sites at Falmouth, and one by one they were demolished. This was the last one being demolished. And so at the end, looking at the system in the 2010s. Now, 2010 coalition government decided they would sell off the GPSS. Tony Blair's government had actually looked into selling it, but the system said it was built during the Second World War. it's always had to be run on a limited budget, and so they thought they might get £750 million for it. And one of the old companies came up to them and said, special deal, we'll take it off you for free. You don't have to pay us to take it away. And they lost interest. At the same time, OPA, we were only 18 of us, and we had a lot of very experienced engineers. For various reasons, people left, and a lot of their experience went. I retired in 2012. The system was run under one contact, and I will explain about. This is a picture of tanks in repair inside a storage tank. And if anybody feels a desperate desire to go inside a storage tank, you can. If you go to Tate Modern, the tanks, Tate Modern was originally built as a oil-fired power station in the 1950s. It used the same design of tanks. Later was turned into an exhibition, and you can actually go inside the tanks. And Robinson in Ruins was my eldest son phoned me up from Tate Britain and said, hey Dad, you're in Tate Britain. And then he explained he didn't mean that I was personally, but there was an exhibition on the government system. This is a pipeline marker, helicopter marker. That's my wife looking at various of the maps. And they had this film called Robinson in Ruins, which I did buy, and it was about someone following a track along the government pipeline from Aldermaston to Upper Hayford. And then the sell-off drew some critical articles from Private Eye. It was suggested that I might be the culprit feeding them. Well, I wasn't. I wanted to get my book published. I knew I had to get agreed by MOD, so I kept very quiet. I have a strong suspicion which former member of OPA was giving them the information, but I've never had that confirmed. But they were not impressed by the sell-off. That's actually showing the system at the end. This is a line watch map for people doing any works near the pipeline. So to conclude, so going through the system, each decade, 30s, 40s construction, 45 decommission, Cold War, expansion, civil storage, 60s onwards commercial fuel, end of civil storage but the Cold War, reduced use of ground fuels and then increased civil aviation, and finally the 2010s for sale. And in 2015, the system was sale announced to CLH, or a Spanish company. It seems that most of our country is owned by someone else. It was sold for 82 million, but also as part of the agreement, MOD were going to pay 237 billion for use of it over the next 10 years. Now, to put this into context, I said I joined OPA in 1990, and MOD paid nothing to use it, and we used to run it at a small surplus. It was about 5 million, so it wasn't a vast amount. And so the maths of that somewhat escaped us old hands, but there we are. What do we know? So basically, that was 2015. So then now the 82 million is long gone. I don't know how much CLH are gaining out of it, because obviously due to the lockdown, very few planes are flying, and so not a lot of aviation is being moved around. And I did read that CLH have now changed their name to Exelum. There might be some around here who are now Exelum on Exelum. And so that's the end. That's me with my book celebrating that it arrived. It is still available either from Amazon or from Folly Books. And I would say, by the way, although I quite like people to buy from Amazon because it pushed me up the list of sales on Cold War histories, I think it's cheaper if you buy from Folly, because I think their price includes postage and packing, and I don't think Amazon doesn't. So are there any questions? I think you need to type at the bottom if you have any questions. I noticed the thing about the Buncefield.
Can you see them on the Q&A tab?
I got Q&A. I didn't know that there doesn't seem to be any questions. I've got someone telling me thanks for a great talk.
No, you're on the chat. If you just click on Q&A.
Okay, right. Right, okay, let's see. Right, okay, so I will catch up. Right, let's just quickly... Fuel trains designed to run from the Isle of Grain is related to civil aviation. I don't know anything about fuel trains, I'm afraid. Why was the system filled with water after World War II? Sorry, I'm catching up rapidly. It was thought to be less likely to corrode than if it was left in air. Okay, I noticed Alden Ferguson, I accept that your knowledge of that is probably better than mine. Is there a map of the Killingholme tunnels? There will be maps, but I don't think they'll be in the public domain. What are Go Devil hatches on the 1897? They are now known as pig traps. They are basically for launching and collecting pigs. Pigs used to be called Go Devils. I think because they were thought to go like the devil, the name was changed to pigs, I think because the devices made a squealing noise as they went along. Flying with my father and I, we used to follow the pipeline built from Aldermaston to the south coast. It was probably a relay you saw, Tim Welburn. Flying with my father, we occasionally followed a pipeline built from Aldermaston to the south coast. A great navigational feature. Was it a new or replacement? If it was the 1960s, it was built during the Second World War, but I said there was this major relay system going on, and that's where you would have seen the scar. I think the scar from the original pipeline built during the war would have gone, but one during the 60s would still be there. Marham is no longer fed. Massingham closed in 1991. Marham is fed from Thetford. How much fuel was lost at Buncefield? I'm afraid I don't know, but I think there were 11 tanks, and the BPA tank was a pretty big tank. The redundant tank pipelines were just left in situ. Once they become officially redundant, they officially become under the landowners. It was one of the problems I actually highlighted when they were looking into selling the system, because when they abandoned these pipelines, they cut them into something like 1 kilometre sections, filled them with water and left them capped off. And the water, the pipes weren't necessarily cleared out entirely well. There was an occasion where one of these pipes full of water was hit. The water came out and caught fire, so it clearly wasn't water. But it's a pollution hazard, and I said that was a long-term one, whether the ministry, when they sold it off, did anything about it, but there is all over the country. And I know there was a particular case where a farmer had to remove it, which he had to pay for, and he did, but he did also then found himself with a load of contaminated liquid, which he had to tanker away. And I did suggest to MOD that they paid for the cost, but without admitting liability. But that's probably it still could be a problem. Anything left at Sandy, the depot is still there. I believe it may be closed down. That is my understanding. The pipeline goes past, but I think it's closed. It's quite an amazing site, Sandy, because it literally is sandy, and it's almost built into the land. It's always one of my favorites. The optical fiber system is no longer there. At one time, I wouldn't have been dared to mention it. It was incredibly secret. It was actually nothing to do with the GPSS. It was a Cold War system put in for communication, with the idea that the pipeline would protect it from a magnetic nuclear impulse. It ran vastly over budget. I do mention it a bit in my book, and it was cleared. it didn't work. It got more and more problematic trying to deploy and get out, and eventually the whole question of it was questionable because the Cold War had ended, so it was removed. It also basically interfered with the pipeline, because the problem with this cable in the pipeline was that you had to have a special type of cleaning pig that wouldn't rip the cable to pieces. The trouble is it didn't clean very well. So when it was removed, I would say that the GPSS could have well broken down in terms of supplying fuel that wasn't contaminated by gunge. So, sorry, this feels like a very Brit way of doing things. Did other countries treat aviation fuel this seriously? I don't know about other systems. I mean, basically, on terms of quality, you've got to be with aviation fuel absolutely at top. You know, there's a saying, there is no lay-by at 10,000 meters. So what I can say is through the whole system, and this applies to the commercial as well as the GPSS, the quality control was absolutely stringent. And I'm not aware of any air crashes that have ever been traced back to problems with fuel, not just on GPSS, but on either the SO or the UCOP system. But as I said, you want to feel fine, because basically when you got your fuel in the plane, they don't have another lot. You know, that is standard for all the engines. It doesn't matter how many engines you've got, it's all the same fuel.
Okie dokie. Well, thank you very much, Tim. I hope everybody enjoyed it. And this will be on our YouTube channel, hopefully over the weekend. Thank you again.